Welcome to the Domestic Violence, Animal Abuse, Child Abuse and Neglect workshop presented by Andrew Campbell. I'm Rick Hugg, Chair of the Planning Committee of the 2020 IUN Forum on Child Abuse and Neglect, and this is the second in our series of October workshops webinars. In addition to Andrew Campbell, I'm joined today by Sandy Runkle, Director of Programs for Prevent Child Abuse Indiana, and by Wendy Hensley, Director of Programs for Mental Health America of Northwest Indiana. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Sandy Runkle, the Director of Programming for Prevent Child Abuse Indiana. Sandy has worked a good deal with Andrew over the past year or two, so she knows Andrew and has worked very well. Sandy, tell us about our presenter today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hugg, and again, thank you for allowing me to introduce Andrew. As Dr. Hugg said, Andrew and I have known each other for several years, and I can promise you all you're in for a treat. It won't be an easy thing to always listen to, but I promise you're going to learn a great deal. Andrew's an expert on family violence and the associated risks of harm for adults, children, and animals residing in homes where this violence occurs. Utilizing cutting-edge data analysis, groundbreaking cross-discipline collaborations, and a personal perspective on violence in the home, he provides education for agencies around the globe and assists in developing more efficient and effective responses to physical and emotional violence. So again, it is very much my pleasure to introduce Andrew Campbell.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Dr. Hugg, the committee, and all of you for the opportunity to speak with you today. These are all topics that I feel very passionately about as will come out as we get further into this. Obviously dealing with changing times. Last year I spoke about 42 times in 23 different states. This is a very important part of my own healing, getting out there and sharing this message. And so obviously this year has looked a lot different. I focused a lot more on writing and then participating virtually such as this. So again, I am grateful for this opportunity. As we're going to cover a lot of material, I speak often, and so each talk I look at it and view in my own mindset as potentially my last time to share this message. So I pack as much information as I can into whatever time I'm given. So we'll cover a lot. You may see me skip a couple slides if I'm running tight on time. The handouts that will be provided will cover the full slide deck. But if you have any questions, obviously as they mentioned with the Q&A box, but also feel free to follow up personally with email too, if you'd like to do it that way. Without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump in today. I'm often asked, why this area, why family violence? It's professional. My research and my work is in this field. It's also personal. As you see myself there with Shelby, as I would get a little older than that, things went very south in my household. I can remember waking up one day to my mom screaming, crying on the floor. I can remember picking her up and saying, hey, if you won't let him back, I will not leave you. I'll take care of you and my younger sister. I won't go anywhere. I'll get a job. And I did legally before I was even able to, and continued to work 2 or 3 jobs through most of my youth and early adulthood to help there. But I said, I won't leave. I'll take care of you guys. I'll be there. I'll be what you need. I'll take care of you. And essentially it meant sacrificing my childhood. I can remember even as I got older, my younger sister couldn't sleep if I wasn't home. I wouldn't hang out with friends. I had to quit sports and do those things. And the stress that I experienced in youth and childhood has created significant changes that we'll talk about as we go on today. But I myself have observable brain changes from toxic stress. In my house, it was quote unquote just emotional, right? We often, we obviously physical injuries we're concerned about. We sometimes lose sight of the emotional underlying injuries that 20 years later I still struggle with. But it was my dog who saved my life. I say that, and I know that to be true. As I would get older, I would contemplate suicide. I would struggle with alcohol abuse and other things. And I don't know where I'd be if it weren't for that dog, but I certainly wouldn't be here today sharing this message. So I speak often about pets, and you know why now. It was my dog who saved my life. In addition to stealing my childhood, the reality is I'm working with doctors and doing things, but I've ended a cycle. But still the experiences in youth and all the stress on my body that created are likely to shorten my life. I've had a couple of, not to be over dramatic, but I've had a couple of pretty scary instances in the last couple of years while speaking. Obviously, anytime I talk about these issues, it brings back a lot of that trauma. And it's just not fair, right? It's going to steal time precious time for me with my own children, you know, memories that I think about, and it's just not fair. I think I would honestly probably be a pretty bitter person, and I did struggle before if I didn't do this work, because this is how I fight back. It often feels, you know, when you're in these types of scenarios that, you know, it's just not fair. But this is a big part of how I fight back and how I heal. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. And with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right in. So when I talked about my own personal experience after I moved out, and I made that promise and then kept it for 13 years. And after 13 years, I moved out when things were, when I felt comfortable about where my mom and sister were. They both were doing well and healthy and safe. I really wanted to make a difference in this field and continue to do so. And so I began to look and think about how I might do that. And my focus became on trying to advance, or at least make additions to the literature and research. And one of the things I noticed pretty quickly is when I began to look at domestic violence literature and prevalence estimates across the U.S., depending on what source you look at and you know, who you're listening to, it seemed like we really didn't have a clue, you know, what was going on. Some people say domestic violence is declining. Others say it's doing the opposite. Some say it's staying the same. So that kind of became my mission. How can I look at some of these things that I'm seeing that there may be some opportunity here to provide some additional insight? When we look at prevalence, and again, when we think about why those numbers may be all over the map, obviously we know, and as you do, I'm sure, there are many barriers to why victims may or may not report their abuse, and we know those to be true. When we look at DV prevalence from a different way, so those numbers I just shared, which are obviously all over the map, usually are retrospective anonymous victim surveys. When we look at it from a different perspective, we know it affects 30 to 40% of families involved in the child welfare system. Depending on where you are in the country, from a law enforcement perspective, it can make up as much as half of police calls. We see that to be true, particularly in some agencies on the East Coast. We see as much as half of their calls being related to DV. And up to 35% of all ER visits are attributable to DV. I also always like to note that we sometimes see a situation where adult victims are more likely to be able to seek care for children than themselves. So if you're working with children in a medical setting, obviously you have opportunity to spot children who are affected or abused, but also adults potentially who bring them in. So when we think about these things, you know, the idea that DV is declining or going away seems very unlikely. And when I spoke in person last year and the years before that, I would usually ask this question and ask for a raise of hands if people thought that DV was declining, and I never had a single hand. And like I said, in the 20-something states that I've spoken in, always the consensus was we're seeing more and more cases, we're being overwhelmed. So with that in mind, I wanted to figure out a way to kind of look at this from a different perspective. So this is a study, again, we're tight on time. In an hour or so as I'll speak today, I'm going to fit as much as I can, and I'm actually speaking in Kansas in a few weeks for about 6.5 hours on this topic. So plenty of material today that I'm going to try to pack in. But this first study and the train of thought that we're going to follow today, I'm not really going to go into, but I'm going to share. So you're going to receive that in your email. But again, I wanted to think of a different way to look at some of this stuff and potentially collect data, and one of the ways that I thought about doing that was by working with law enforcement. And so for this study, I analyzed nearly 10,000 police reports in Indianapolis of domestic violence. I looked at all different types of characteristics, different, you know, settings, environments, all different types of things. And again, I'm not going to get into this study today. I'm going to focus more on the follow-up, because as I dove deeper into that, what became increasingly clear is the importance of viewing these three as a team. You'll see a female pictured here as the adult victim. We acknowledge and know that men are also victimized by intimate partner violence. When we add the pet piece, as we're doing today, though, it's almost overwhelmingly always a female adult victim and a male perpetrator. The percentages gets closer to 96%, at least, again, what's reported to law enforcement. But it just became so clear the importance of viewing these three as a team, and that being the adult victim, children, and any pets in the home. In my opinion, as I get deeper and deeper into this, we cannot best help any that you see here without acknowledging the needs and helping all of them. We know that pets are often present in these homes. I think I'll share this later in the presentation, but on average in the U.S., population estimates are that about 65%, I believe it is, of U.S. households have a pet. This number actually goes up to 80% when we're talking about domestic violence or family violence. So pets are actually more likely to be in a home where abuse is occurring. At least in my studies in Marion County and in other communities, 60% of the time, a police report for domestic violence will come from a home where a child resides. So we very often see children and pets in these homes. We often focus our attention when we think about prevention and many aspects toward the adult. you know, we're missing opportunity when we don't think about these two pieces here, and which is where I often focus most of my work, not only to help them, but also to provide resources and to look at different opportunities for data and things such as that, as we'll get into as we continue. Some quotes from actual victims from these homes where this type of thing was occurring. It wasn't until I told him I was leaving that he began to target my children and cats. And I hear that often from victims of this idea of perpetrators kind of sensing that the adult victim may be about to leave the home or end the relationship or call 911 or pursue something like that. And perpetrators kind of describe this animal abuse sometimes as an idea of, or a means of kind of changing things up, trying to regain control or reassert themselves in that manner. He said that if I left, it would be a death sentence for my beagle. My kids love that dog so much, and I knew he would kill it if I left, so I stayed for 5 more years. Unfortunately, in this scenario and in this community, the domestic violence shelter had no resources for animals. And so again, this victim is forced with this decision to essentially leave this beagle behind, who would likely be killed, which is, you know, what her belief was, and probably for good reason, and knowing how devastated her kids would be, or you know, to stay in that home. And again, we think about 5 more years in a violence and abusive scenario and environment, how damaging that is, you know, for all involved, and the risks, and particularly as we're focusing on children today, the mental and emotional effects of 5 more years of abuse. The cats are completely different now that we have them. I remember how skittish they were in her home. It's as if they were absorbing the fear and stress my daughter was experiencing. Unfortunately, the heartbreaking words from a father whose daughter was killed in an act of intimate partner violence. And you know, I just will always remember, you know, the way he talked about this. He said, you know, they often made fun of the cats as being so weird. You know, when they'd go and visit, the cats would hide. He said they just acted so weird, and it always became a joke. And you know, he said now that we have them, you know, because they took them in after his daughter's death, unfortunately. They're completely normal. They act like normal cats do now. They're out, they're engaging, they want to be around people as much as, or at least as much as cats do. And you know, it just was heartbreaking when I realized the cats were showing us the fear and stress that was, you know, my daughter was experiencing in that home. So again, we're going to focus a lot today on the child and pet piece as we speak and move forward, or as I speak and move forward. But again, acknowledging that obviously the adult piece is very important as well. Again, we have to protect all if we want to protect any, in my opinion. When we think about risks specifically for children, we know the physical risks are great. I'm going to focus more on emotional and psychological injury and harm, but we know the physical risks are great. Again, sharing a real example. A child whose mother had just ended the relationship with the abuser. She was actually a nurse working a night shift, and the perpetrator showed up knowing the mom would be at work, and his words to the child were, you know, I'm sorry, this is the only way she's going to learn, and proceeded to physically assault the child. I think it was for around an hour, ending in a severe strangulation episode. The child survived, but with catastrophic injury. So I share that because as I'll focus on emotional harm today, we also acknowledge obviously physical injury and harm is very real and very high in these homes as well. You know, if I hear from agencies around the country sometimes though that's all they look for, and so responders, I've had many tell me, and it may not be the same in your community, but I hear this from communities, so I share it. You know, that when we respond to these incidents, particularly thinking of law enforcement or other agencies such as that, you know, we're looking for that visible injury. If we see bruises, if we see clear abrasions, then we know to report to DCS. There are good studies out there that indicate only about 4% of children on scene in these homes will have that. So again, if we're only looking for that clear, obvious, visible injury, we're missing as much as 96% of children who are likely to be significantly impacted by what is occurring there in the home. When we think of sexual abuse, it kind of varies, it seems, depending on where the study is located and the parameters for the study, but usually we're looking at anywhere from 33 to 70% of a sexual abuse rate for children in homes where intimate partner violence occurs. Emotional harm, as I said, is what I'll focus on today. It's what I know best because it's what I experienced. As I said, for the first part of my career when I was branching out and starting my own organization to do these types of things, I often left out my own story. I had a lot of fear there. I grew up for a long time in youth, always afraid that my mom was going to be taken from me. In the middle of the night, I wouldn't sleep. I would be up all night, just afraid that something was going to happen to her. And I feared the same when I started talking out about these things. So I always kind of kept my own story out. But now, as I began to get further into this, I don't want to do that. As I said, it's my truth and my story, and I think it's an important part and piece of what I bring today. We know that children are often much more aware of what's going on than caregivers realize. Again, thinking of my own personal story, thinking about being able to hear things through the wall in my room and then run, turn the light off, pretend like I'm asleep, could hear the door open, and they would think that I didn't hear anything, whoever it was that was coming to the door. And we know that to be true. There's good studies out there that show children often are very, very well aware of events and incidents that are occurring in the home that their caregivers think that they have not witnessed or haven't been exposed to. How do you think they're are affected emotionally by threats or harm to pets? Obviously, extremely so. Fortunately, like I said, my pet was there. My pet was not harmed in terms of my dog, Shelby, and was able to get me through. But that's not the case, unfortunately, for many children in some of these homes where the pets are threatened or harmed. And there's something about animal abuse, particularly speaking about perpetrators in homes where these types of things occur. If they say they're going to do it, they almost always do it, even more so than other forms of abuse. If the perpetrator, intimate partner violence, child abuse perpetrator in the home says, I'm going to harm the pets, they almost always do it. And I think families know that and sense that. And so again, children are significantly impacted by threats and harm to pets in these homes. When we think about how the emotional maltreatment they're likely to experience, when we're talking about what's going on in these homes, how it affects them, obviously in many ways. Like I said, we often sometimes can get caught up in this idea that and physical abuse, I'm not trying to understate it, but we do know that fractures and bruises will heal and fade, but these emotional injuries will last a lifetime. And I stand here as living proof, or sit here, I guess, as living proof. It doesn't mean you can't go on and be healthy and happy and have your own family and things like that, but these things never go away. I still struggle daily with some of the harm that I've experienced, not just physiologically, but also just mentally and emotionally. These things do not relent. And sometimes we call victims from these homes, they go on to be survivors, and I know there's importance there, but I've always felt as myself being more as surviving, because survivor implies that it's behind me and I'm good, and that's not at all the case. It does not relent. So we're going to look a little more at how this emotional harm affects children as they get older. It affects them from the earliest stages of infancy and even before birth. I give an entire talk just on some of those risks even before birth. But we know children at early ages are extremely dependent on a healthy, safe environment that's conducive to growth, to health. And unfortunately, many of the children in these homes don't receive that, right? And while it's not to say that we can't work with these children, that there's not hope, but the reality is for some of these things, particularly in the early years, it is a one-shot deal. Some of the damage that's done to the brain, or the lack of opportunity for growth that we do see occurring becomes is irreversible, and we don't get that back. We know that toxic stress exposure is extremely harmful. Again, I talk about my own experiences, and I think about at 13, 14, 15, just sitting outside, so overwhelmed, middle of the night, not sleeping, crying, upset, constant stomach aches, constant headaches, only eating a few days a week. My dog sat there with me and helped me, but just the exposure and the stress was just enormous, and the effects, unfortunately, quite severe. One of the main things that we fear when we talk about toxic stress exposure, particularly in youth and for adults too, is this excess exposure to the hormone cortisol. So cortisol is one of multiple hormones our bodies release to kind of restore homeostasis. So when we have a stress response, our heart rate goes up, our blood pressure goes up, we have this increasing emotion. Cortisol is released by our body to bring us back down. This is supposed to be something very quick, just a quick release, bring us back down. Unfortunately for children in these homes, their stress system is firing all the time. So we see cortisol being, released all the time. And this can cause really great harm to our bodies. We see harm to developing brains. As I said, I myself have observable brain changes. I was told I had the brain of a severe alcoholic. I don't know that was the great bedside manner by the radiologist who told me that, but at that point I had never drank alcohol in my entire life, up to that point, and was told that I had that. And I know now, I didn't know at the time, it was like, what's going on. Now I understand more about toxic stress and how that can severely impact many of our organs. We also see an alteration in our body's stress response, right? So in the future, these children will either respond with a hyperactive response, or they'll be kind of this flat affect and under-responsive. It really does great damage to our body in many different ways. When we think about further about how toxic stress affects children, obviously, we're concerned about children and even adults being impacted by this, but particularly for younger children, it seems to create the most severe deficits. You see this chart here, image here, showing you that particularly in those early years, when our systems are developing rapidly, right? If that, it makes sense if that's interrupted, we're going to see the longest lasting and most catastrophic effects. Again, it doesn't mean obviously all children at any age we're worried about, particularly those early years though. When I talk about some of those things that we don't get a second chance at, you know, when we're born, our brains aren't fully developed and we're dependent on this safe environment to allow us to fully develop. And when that's not happening, unfortunately, we see some of these deficits that I'm describing. It can be visualized as well. I think a pretty powerful image to look at, just looking at, this is a 3-year-old child's brain in a normal, considered safe environment on the left, and then an extremely neglectful. In terms of the case study, I couldn't find any evidence that there was any physical or sexual abuse. It was mostly sensory deprivation. So essentially what we're talking about today in terms of not having that healthy environment that's conducive to growth. So we can't actually observe. You know, we talk about these often as being invisible injuries, but there is a way in some ways to observe how it impacts us. And then here's another, I think this is a PET scan. And when we're looking at a PET scan, we're looking at your red areas and yellow being kind of active areas of blood flow. And you see kind of a normal, more healthy child on the left there. And then you see on the right, I believe this was a child, I think this was from a Romanian study, yes, from a neglectful environment. Again, same thing, no real indication of physical or sexual abuse, but this sensory deprivation, neglect, and things such as that. And you see the kind of dramatic effect in terms of you know, just looking at those brains side by side. So I've described a lot about obviously concerns we have in these homes, particularly for children emotionally. There's high risk physical abuse, sexual abuse, of emotional abuse. In person, I'd be putting you on the spot to answer this, but for the sake of this presentation, you can just kind of think of your answer to yourself. When officers arrive on scene from one of my studies, they most often report the adult victim to be afraid, complaining of pain, and crying. This is from Marion County. So again, I speak all over the country, but it's nice when I'm speaking to audiences largely in my own state because, well, I think the data and information is relevant everywhere. It's particularly relevant as it comes from here in Indiana. But we see the adult appearing afraid, complaining of pain, and crying. Obviously, not a surprise. But again, when you think of this as being probably the child's best chance for a human secure attachment, you know, and seeing them in this manner, how do you think the child appears most often to law enforcement when they arrive? And this is arriving on the scene of an intimate partner violence, normally a 911 call. We see children most commonly appearing calm. And it sounds backwards, right? Because you think, why would you be worried about calm children? And in fact, sometimes when I give this talk and share this information, I hear from agencies, you know, and I have heard this, you know, well, thank goodness the child's calm. We dodged a bullet there, right? You know, everything going on in the home and they're still calm, right? But no, we add that to what I've just talked about in terms of this idea of a damaged stress response. We're worried that this is normal life for the child, right? That they see this all the time, that they become desensitized to it. We're worried that they've been maybe threatened, that if they respond a certain way when law enforcement arrives, there'll be greater harm to them or to their family. We're also worried because, you know, just because someone's calm on the outside doesn't mean their stress system is firing like crazy on the inside. And you know, I describe my own stress system and talking about these things always, unfortunately, brings back some of that trauma. I've gotten to a point now where I can appear at least fairly calm as I'm speaking, but it's not what's going on the inside. And we often know that to be true about some of these children too. So I think it's always important to note, just because a child appears calm on scene, as they often do, again, half the time, and a large N number here over 1,300 cases, it doesn't mean that they are calm and that things are okay. I mean, for all the reasons that we've talked about before, you know, I think we fail to acknowledge toxic stress. I think it's kind of the silent killer in these homes. But those who do at least acknowledge that it does steal childhoods. I described it stealing my own. We sometimes though forget that it also steals from the other end too. And that's what I'm talking about. It's so unfair. Not only does it steal your childhood and are you experiencing such stress when you should be experiencing nothing like that stress. You should be able to be a kid and having fun and you know, doing things and enjoying your life. Not only does it steal that, it's also going to shorten your adult life. So if you do break the cycle and move on and are happy and have children in a safe and healthy environment, it's probably going to cut your time short with them. And so again, it's why I speak of it often, because I think it's such an important aspect of the homes that we're describing today. I do think that there is some hope in visualizing these invisible injuries. As I talk with many agencies, they often say, well, we understand the emotional harm, but how do we prove it? Again, this is early on in the information that's out there, but it's something that I have a lot of interest in, is measuring cortisol levels. As I said, our bodies release cortisol when we're experiencing high levels of stress. You can see over here on the left, this would be kind of a normal flow. Our bodies kind of have a normal flow and release with kind of a bump here in the morning hours, and then a gradual decrease over time. You can actually measure cortisol levels, and children from these homes will often have either a very high level, early levels, and then a more dramatic slope, or they'll have lower levels. Whether high or low, anything different than average puts our bodies at risk, and ourselves at risk of suffering from many different things, including illness. It even puts us more susceptible to illness. So it's something important to remember. Again, we're tight on time, so I'm not going to get into the science of this one, but there was also a study that looked specifically at controlling for if the child's mother suffered abuse, and what they actually found was, we didn't see these higher cortisol levels in children just because the mother suffered abuse. If the mother suffered abuse herself as a child, but provided appropriate and necessary care, we saw these levels kind of stay low. If they did not react and respond appropriately to the child, then we saw the child's response go up. So even from children, a second generation, right? Again, breaking the cycle. If they're in that healthy and safe environment, their cortisol levels will be lower. So again, I think there's promise here. This is kind of early on, and there's studies just now beginning to develop, but I think there could be a way down the road, at least, to visualize some of these invisible injuries we're describing today. As we shift now to pets and think about what pets provide, think about your own pets, right? Think about animals in your own life that you have now, that you've had in the past. Pets provide a lot, right? They provide protection, comfort, friendship. This is just a short list. They provide many more things. Acceptance, stability, hope, light in the darkness. They provide entertainment and laughter. All of these things are so critical to emotional health and well-being. How much more so are they for children in these homes? Again, think of the children I've described today, and everything they're up against, adults too, but particularly the children as kind of the focus of our talk today. How important are pets to them? For many of these kids, and it's a sad but real truth, the pet may be their best chance at everything you see on that list. And it may not mean that the victimized caregiver doesn't want to give them these things, but in many cases, you have a perpetrator and you have a victimized caregiver who simply has nothing left. They've had so much taken from them, they just have nothing left, and it has nothing to do with them not wanting to be there for the children. They just have nothing left, and the pets often step up and fill these roles at least the best they can in many ways. So again, we think about how important pets are to everyone. How much more so important are they to kids in the homes we're describing? A recent survey of Americans, in a word, pets are family, is kind of how you sum them up in one word. And a recent survey of Americans, about, I think it was 95 to 97%, described that they considered a pet to be part of the family. I don't know what was wrong with the other 3% if they didn't understand the question or they were having an off day. But Americans overwhelmingly consider a pet to be part of their family. When we think about pets in America, again, I alluded to this earlier, it's actually 68% of U.S. homes have at least one pet. We see them being much more likely, up to 80%, to be present in homes where abuse or violence occurs. Most commonly in homes where we see this abuse occurring are dogs. So more than half the time it's a dog. We see cats being present often as well. I think it's important to note, though, if we think about pets being targeted because of what they're providing to victims, and that's often the case, right? And for abusers who want to create the system or an environment of control, these pets providing the opposite, providing support, providing love, and things like that, does make them a target. And so if we think of it that way, dog, cat, whatever the animal is, they all would be at risk. Thinking even of maybe a more rural environment, thinking of things we don't generally think of as being pets, such as cows or chickens or pigs or something like that. Anytime there's an animal who is providing some sort of comfort or at least something for these victims, I believe that they too would be at risk when we think about this scenario. We know that victims of intimate partner violence often report great concern for their pet after fleeing their home. And it's a great limiter to progress. So let's say they do defy odds, they leave the home, they make it to shelter. The shelter doesn't allow pets. I can think of many, and as I get further and further into this, I hear from more and more. many victims who said it was just too much, that they couldn't, now I'm in shelter, I'm supposed to be healing, I'm supposed to be starting the process for me and my children, and all I can think about is that pet I had to leave behind. What are they going to do to that pet? What's going to happen? Many of them return. I've heard that from several too. I got there, and it felt off because, my pet wasn't with me. And I think it's important to think about that. And there are barriers for shelters to house animals. But as a shelter, if our goal and our aspect is to show these victims that we're in their corner, how can we really do that if we're having them or making them leave their corner behind, right? For most of these victims, these pets are their corner. That's their one positive, that's their one support. And if we're going to expect them to leave that behind at the hands of an abuser that they feel no longer safe with, it seems unlikely they're going to do that. And so we do see them being very limited by this and often as a reason for them to return. A recent international survey found that about 90% of victims of IPV feel having a safe place to bring their pet would make their decision to leave easier. Again, think about those numbers, 90%. We think of all the barriers to getting victims out of these homes and away from perpetrators, and just having something that 90% say would make it easier. We have to take that seriously, and I think it's a major aspect that we need to improve. In the U.S., only 17% of U.S. DV shelters accept pets on site. There are more now that set up foster systems and things such as that, which is better than nothing. It still separates a child from a pet, and for young children in these homes who don't know anything but violence and stress, they're not going to just believe and trust that a stranger is keeping their pet safe. It doesn't mean that it's not happening and the pet's not safe. It's very hard for children to believe that. And there's some things that you can do to kind of help with that. But the reality is it seems to be on-site, in person, where the child can still see the pet is the best way to go. This number was only at about 9% a couple years ago. So we see organizations such as Red Rover and and other major organizations who are working to kind of bridge this gap for shelters. So we do see it increasing. But still, obviously, thinking about 90% of victims saying one thing makes it easier, knowing that most of them do have a pet, and still only seeing that 17% kind of saddens me. And I think it's an important need that we need to continue to look at addressing. A study here out of child abuse and neglect that I'll share some actual child narratives of what I've been describing today and how this looks in some of these homes. My dad last week said that he was very upset with my mother and that he was going to burn the bird's wings with a lighter. That day that my dad said he would burn my dog on the grill, I took him into my room and locked him in the closet with food and water until the next day. My dog always sleeps with me in my room so that my dad doesn't hurt him. I have this last one in yellow. This is from a national study, but I actually have heard of a case similar in Indiana where a child was falling asleep in the classroom. Teachers just assumed that, maybe he was up late playing video games or something, as you would expect kids that age to be doing. He was getting in trouble for just falling asleep all the time. In-tuned school counselor started to sense that something might be a little off there and ask him why. Why do you keep falling asleep? Why does this keep happening? And the child said, well, I can't sleep at night with my German Shepherd. He's too big. It's hard for us both to fit in my bed, and he keeps me up all night. And so then, the counselor said, well, don't sleep with your dog. And the child said, well, you see, my dad hurts my mom, and he told me that if one of these days I'm going to wake up and that dog is going to be gone. And so the only way to know he's still there and will be there tomorrow is if I'm holding him throughout the night. So again, it doesn't always mean that when a child's falling asleep in the classroom that it's their dog being harmed. But again, a real example that I've now heard multiple times that I think is important to think about and acknowledge. So all of this kind of led into my follow-up. I shared the original study, just the image of it, and it should be in your email that you'll be able to look at it if you'd like. But again, as I went through all the characteristics of abuse and domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and all those nearly 10,000 police reports I looked at, it just became so overwhelmingly obvious how important this pet piece was. There seemed to be no greater indicator of increased risk, at least in what I was looking at from police report perspective, than pet abuse. So it became the focus of another study that should be shared with you, and that we're going to hit on a few highlights of at this time. One of the things that I was able to develop in looking at these, and again, nearly 10,000 cases, was kind of a sample timeline of family violence. And it doesn't mean it always fits this way, but looking at all these cases, and now I'm well over hundreds of thousands of cases I've looked at from all over the country and internationally as well. And developing kind of a sample timeline, because I think this is something important to think about. Obviously, we're concerned about families that are experiencing family violence in any manner, but we may ask families if they've experienced family violence or domestic violence or things, but I think there's also importance to asking how many times. And again, it doesn't mean that if it's just one that we're not as concerned, but I think there's good reason to do that, and here's why. What I found quickly, and what I've seen kind of repeated in looking at other states as well, was on average, victims of family violence or intimate partner violence will experience 10 incidents before they call 911. So you see the 10th incident highlighted there. That's kind of the average. And again, when we're already concerned, right, with 10 incidents, we've already have this cycle of violence and abuse occurring in the home before we get that first 911 call. I think it's why agencies often say that they feel like they're behind the 8 ball from the get-go and working with these homes and families. Again, this cycle of violence already well on its way. When the abuser also harms pets. So 10th incident is on average, intimate partner violence occurs in Marion County. That's when they call 911. When the abuser harms pets, I think it often occurs around that incident that we start to see things change, and it results in this critical delay. So now instead of getting the call on the 10th incident, on average, we get the call somewhere between 20 and 40. And that's a big deal. Again, when we think about domestic violence, every incident matters. Every incident increases in severity and violence. And so you have this yellow area that you see kind of listed here as being this critical delay zone that often occurs when we start to see pet abuse, occurring more frequently. I think children are at risk, obviously, in any time family violence is occurring. They are in my opinion, extra risk here. So often, we see victims making this call, so the perpetrator may kind of get a light of that or feel that the victim is about to do something. And often I hear from perpetrators, so they change up the violence. They begin to more actively target children and pets. So again, it results in this critical delay here where we have all these extra victimizations before the 911 call. We see in studies for good reason that often at the highest risk for these families, or at least for the adult victim, is when they seek shelter, and we do see a lot of homicides unfortunately occur during that time. But again, remember this delay, this critical delay here, because I think that this is a zone where risk is extremely high for children and pets in these families. Looking at some of the findings from this study, and we'll keep moving, as I said, a lot of info to cover in a short period of time. But again, just looking at a single characteristic, again, this is from the same study I'm looking here in Indianapolis. So just in general, IPV, report to law enforcement, 8% of the time, the suspect has a history of raping or forced sex with the victim. Just know one thing, one characteristic, and that is that the suspect also abuses pets in the home, and you jump to 26%. Again, one variable, adding one characteristic, IPV suspect who also has this history of harming animals in the home. Strangulation, 47% in general, already concerning. Some of the national estimates are around 10 to 30. So we're already very high at strangulation in terms of rates there in Marion County. Just in general, add in the pet piece, just one piece of the IPV suspect also has a history of harming the pets in the home, and now you're at nearly 80%. Toxic stress, we've talked about all of its effects, or a lot of them today. The idea that the perpetrator controls the victim's daily activity, usually it's to the extent where they can't leave or do anything without permission. Obviously extremely emotionally damaging. 55% in general, we're worried by that. 84%, just knowing, again, one piece, one question. Does the suspect have a history of also harming animals? Looking at daily fear that the suspect will kill them. This is important for many reasons, but when we think about PTSD, which many victims in these homes suffer from, we know that this idea or fear of death and how long you experience it can have a correlation with the severity of PTSD symptoms. We know 35% of the time again, everything on the left we're worried about too. We're already worried that 35% of the time in Marion County, victims live every day thinking they're going to be killed. Jumps to nearly 80%. Again, one thing, just knowing that suspect also harms animals. So for all the things that we've talked about, I mean, it's obvious to me, and again, I know we're sharing a lot of information in a short period of time, but we think about risk, we think about possible safety. There's such importance in this piece right here, and in protecting it. As I said, for me, it was life-giving that my dog breathed life into me like no one else could. Other humans I went to, I remember one person, I think I was 14, maybe 15. I described what was going on. It's not fair. I don't know what, it's just, and their words were to me were, well, don't kill yourself. That's literally all they said to me. And my dog never said a word, but actually said everything I ever needed to hear. He sat there with me through it all. He was with me through it all. And it's still long after that last walk, unfortunately, and after I had him for 17 years, but after I lost him, I could still hear his voice, and he still spoke those truths into me, and that life and love into me. And so this bond is so incredibly important. When it's protected, and when we're protecting it and we're including pets in family violence plans, as we don't often do, but hopefully for the reasons we've described today and for many more, you can see the necessity of doing that. These pets are part of the family. They must be included in safety plans. They are so important to the adults and children in these homes. And also the pet's important in protecting them, even just for that aspect. When they're protected and they're in these homes, when we think about, again, all the harmful effects of cortisol release and exposure to emotional harm, we see studies such as this that actually describe that, and this one just focused on dogs, but that it's actually a significant buffer in helping mitigate some of the emotional harm. This study in particular actually found it to be a greater buffer than the buffer of the victimized caregiver in the home. So again, the idea that the pet was providing a greater buffer for emotional harm that was occurring in these homes than the humans were. Again, something that we can't ignore when we think about child health and safety and trying to figure out how to navigate these types of situations. Unfortunately, when it goes the other way, again, we're very concerned. Unfortunately, 75% of pet abuse that occurs in the home is seen by children. And when we think about it in the context of intimate partner violence, it's usually a perpetrator going out of their way to make sure they see it, right? If it's an act to try to inflict control and to show their power and dominance, they're going to want to inflict as much harm as possible. And so we often see them going and getting the children, bringing them into the room, and then committing the act so that the children directly witness it. That's obviously extremely harmful for all in the home, but particularly when we think about for children. It seems to kind of set a cycle in motion. And the younger the child is, the more quickly it seems to jumpstart that cycle. When we think about children and committing acts of animal abuse, obviously we have to pay attention. I often say, we need to look back. So if a child is committing an act of animal abuse, we need to look back and just explore and see if maybe they themselves have been abused or if they've witnessed animal abuse. Because we know if we don't effectively intervene, children who commit acts of animal abuse will go on to harm other humans and animals in the home, as well as in the community and often in the classroom. We see this just continually occurring, this cycle. So again, if children are committing acts, intentional acts of abuse and harm to animals, we have to pay attention. We have to think about what may be happening to them, and we also have to recognize what they will likely perpetrate in the future if we don't effectively intervene. For sake of time, I'm not going to share this. This is actually an excerpt from an interview where a perpetrator describes this history of emotional harm in his home and also of committing acts of animal abuse. Here you have this short clip here that he stated that during this time he was cutting up animals. He would fantasize what it would be like to cut up a human being. And this is an excerpt from the police interviews with notorious American serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Again, it doesn't mean that everyone who's from an emotionally violent home who then harms animals becomes a serial killer, thankfully, but we do see this often in serial killer histories, and we often think of serial killers, well, I don't think it's novel to think that they've been abused or harmed, but sometimes we don't see that physical sexual violence. We see this emotional harm. They act out against animals, then they act out against humans. We also see this same history in other individuals who commit acts of mass terror or mass violence, and school shooters and other mass shooters. So again, it doesn't mean that every child who experiences this becomes or goes on to do this, but I think it's important to note, and at least to the extreme end, that we do see many of these individuals who are engaging in these just horrific behaviors who do have that same history. I'm going to transition now and talk a little bit about a kind of a different way to visualize everything we've talked about, and just an exciting project that I'm partnering with Prevent Child Abuse Indiana, and looking at kind of new ways to explore this overlap that we've described before, and that's through spatial mapping. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of any other program anywhere that's beginning to look at some of these relationships the way we are, which is kind of exciting to explore some of these same things that we've talked about. Obviously not exciting that they're happening, but exciting to think about maybe a new perspective might provide some new information. And so when we look at animal-related incidents, again, the idea behind this project is looking at data from animal welfare agencies across the state of Indiana, as well as police reports for domestic violence, and looking at where these incidents may overlap. Again, we know children are always at risk in a home where intimate partner violence occurs, but we know that there is this elevated risk when there's also animal abuse occurring. So looking at different regions of the state and how these incidents may or may not overlap. Unfortunately, much like child abuse, domestic violence, and other types of incidents, we see animal-related incidents, and this includes abuse, stray dogs, bites. These are animal control incidents, which I've actually found correlation and risk to humans by looking at all incidents, so I usually include them all. We see these incidents increasing too each year. Here you see in Marion County up through 2016 with kind of a stair-stepping there. We see them occurring everywhere. So this is just 1 year of animal-related incidents in Marion County. Some of the areas of sparing you see there are actually out of jurisdiction. So Lawrence has their own department. The airport obviously has their own type of thing, and Speedway does as well. So essentially any area that you see here is within Indianapolis jurisdiction. We see these animal-related incidents or harm to animals, often harm to animals or other things as well, often happening in areas where we have high density or a high population density of children. So anytime this is all animal incidents in Marion County, and anytime you see the darker shades are higher or denser child populations. So we do see them often occurring in areas where we have a lot of children, these acts of or these calls to animal control. You see a hot spot now here map looking just at animal abuse or neglect. Again, we know when this is occurring, we're very concerned for animals and the humans in these homes. In 2016, I pull these hotspot maps by taking all the incidents and looking at the area of the highest concentration. You see them largely being localized there to the east side, although we do have other areas here that were concerning. In 2016 and in 17, we see it continue to expand out, and to my understanding, continue to do that. And again, that's very concerning, right? I think when we think about harm to animals as a potential indicator of higher risk and things like that, when we think about the fact that animal abuse is stretching and expanding across the city, it's not as much of a stress to think about we're also breaking records for homicides and seeing high rates of other forms of violence, both in the home and community as well. When we look at, again, hotspots and just think about other ways to kind of visualize some of this information. So animal control runs in Brown County, which is an extremely rural community. You see where they have the highest number of calls there, kind of light up animal control runs from 2016 to 2018. And look at where separate data source, domestic violence. And again, sometimes when I share these things, it's usually the first feedback I get is, well, these are just population maps. These are just where the population is greatest. Not the case. That area in Marion County that I just shared where we saw the most cases was actually about 12th or 13th on the list of population density. But then when we look at rural communities, again, we see the same thing, right? And this idea that we see animal control runs in the same areas where we're also seeing reports of domestic violence from two separate data sources. Another way that I think is important to visualize and think about, so here are and this is in Boone County and the Zionsville area there, the highest number of animal control runs in 2017, and look at the year following for domestic violence. And so I think there's value too in looking at it year by year. So again, when you think back through that timeline and what I described, we have this idea that, when on average victims report at the 10th incident, if animal abuse occurs or animal incidents occur, they often delay by 10 to 30 incidents, which actually equates to about 8 to 12 months. So again, if we're thinking about, the importance of working with animal welfare agencies, if we're understanding that risk to animals here could very well indicate, and often likely does, risk to humans too in these homes, we're potentially getting in there an entire year before the 911 call, which again would put us closer to that 10th incident when we normally get in. So again, I think for me, it's very compelling to think about this idea of improving our relations with some of these animal welfare agencies and ensuring that we're taking advantage of potential opportunities to get in there an entire year earlier. And when we look at them just as scattered dots, and again, just looking at incidents, again, we see DV in Marion County. The same year we see animal incidents. Again, not population maps. Some of our highest levels of concentration are actually about 12th or 13th on the list in terms of population density, with some of these areas being much more dense. Another point I want to add, and we haven't really talked a whole lot about COVID-19 today. Again, for sake of time, I give just a 60-minute lecture just on what COVID-19 has done to everything, or at least our response to it, everything that we've described today. I do want to add though here at this point that, when we think about during lockdown, we lost a lot of domestic violence reports. A lot of, schools are one of our major child welfare or child abuse report sources. And those a lot of phones went silent, which would be great if we thought abuse was ending. But, honestly, many of us were more afraid that we had reduced opportunity to detect these things, and that's why it wasn't being reported. So a lot of these incidents and calls quit coming in. These did not. Animal incidents still kept coming in, and there was no reason for it to be affected, and I'll get into that as we go in a couple slides. But I think it's important to remember, again, value. These are two separate data sources, looking at animal welfare data from animal control, looking at law enforcement data for domestic violence. We see this mapping, again, not just population density. There was a lot of value during the pandemic and as it continues and during lockdown, and to, again, if we have these relationships in place where we can at least make pretty educated guesses of where highest risk is. This isn't just Marion County. I shared Boone County. Here's also Allen County. Here's Fort Wayne, looking at similar patterns and how they overlap. And then here's another kind of overlay of Boone County, looking at where domestic violence and animal abuse incidents are reported in the same year. I alluded to how these reports weren't as impacted during lockdown, and that speaks to the report source. So when we're looking at police reports for domestic violence or intimate partner violence, these most commonly come from the victim themselves. The victim will call 911, and that's where the domestic violence police report, it's around 70 to 80% of the time that it will be the victim themselves who called in. When we're talking about animal abuse, animal control reports, 80% of the time it's a neighbor or bystander. So while neighbors only report 8% of domestic violence, they report 80% of animal abuse. So again, when we think through the lockdown and COVID-19 and everything that happened, everyone's spending much more time in their home, neighbors, and have greater opportunity potentially to detect animal abuse. No reason to believe they're less likely to report it. And then we have human victims trapped in a home with an abuser and very limited opportunity to potentially report it. So again, I think it speaks, to the importance of improving our relationships with these agencies, and I think there's clear benefit beyond obviously what we're dealing with now, but even if it's just for that, just the idea that neighbors will report animal abuse. So when we get those reports, again, we need to be working with animal welfare and make sure they understand we're also worried about humans in the home too, because it may be a unique opportunity where a neighbor is reporting concern when they won't typically or as typically report that about humans in the home. I'm going to wrap up here in about probably about 5 to 10 minutes. But I want to quickly touch on a couple ideas for effective identification, prevention, and intervention. Again, I think I included 3 of my studies on this topic that will go further into some of these things. Just for sake of time, I try to limit, or I am limited in terms of what I can share. So I wanted to maximize that time, but then also share studies that if you have interest, you could read later. We know that animal abuse, as I've indicated, is also a great indicator of risk for responders. And I have law enforcement picture here, but in my opinion, it's an increased risk for anyone who responds or works with these families. You can see that visualized here in a heat map that shows on the left spatial areas in Marion County where officers were actually injured responding to an incident. And then also the highest concentration of animal control runs, again, not just population density. I think it's also important to note when I often use this map also to make sure animal control knows you're responding to areas and environments that are likely high risk for you. And so we often kind of underplay the work of animal control, and I know that often happens, and really anything could be farther from the truth, or nothing could be farther from the truth. Their work is, I see it as critical in improving our work to protect humans. As well as animals, but then also that they are often at great risk when responding as well. I showed these charts for the risk to victims, and I want to share it as, obviously this indicates risk for victims as well, but also for those responding. So again, just IPV suspect from one of my studies in Marion County, 47% of them have a mental illness or abuse a substance, jumps to 74% just knowing that they also abuse animals. History of suicide, threats, or attempts, 10% in general, 4 times that, just knowing one thing, right, that they abuse or harm animals in the home as well. Access to a firearm, usually considered that they have one. I don't know necessarily why they ask it that way, but it's how they ask it. 31% in general, 68%. So now we have a perpetrator who, obviously who harms humans and animals, much more likely to have mental illness, to abuse a substance, to have threatened or attempted suicide, and to have a gun. So again, when we talk about risk for all who are responding, I see it as great. More so than just having a weapon, we look at how many of them have used that weapon against a partner. 26% in general jumps to 66%. Again, just knowing one thing, that they also harm animals. It's why I often say, you know, if I was a police officer, I would want to know right away if, when I'm responding to these incidents, if the abuser has a history of harming animals. Obviously, all of these incidents, I hear law enforcement often describe them as kind of walking on eggshells when they're responding to intimate partner violence. There's always a lot of uncertainty and sometimes chaos occurring. But I would want to know very quickly, given just knowing that if the abuser harms animals, how dramatically risk spikes. We see many agencies asking the question. So this is an example from, I think it's Massachusetts. Yeah, this is what officers in Massachusetts ask when responding to domestic violence. We see it as the 19th question: has the offender abused animals or pets? More and more agencies are asking it. Again, I would say this is something I would want to know right away, because if we get a yes here, statistically speaking, from data and what's available in research, I can put yeses here. So again, yes on question 19 fills out yeses on all those. It's something I want to know. It's something we need to be including when we're thinking about intake and working with these victims. We want to be asking about this, and we want to be asking pretty quickly. I would want to know almost right away. Again, one yes here, statistically speaking, gives you yeses here. So it's an important question to ask and to be asking early too. The other final point, or the final point I'll make about responding agencies and working with these perpetrators, I described how the adult victim appeared on scene and how children appear on scene. How do you think these suspects appear on scene? So these are ones that data clearly indicates present the highest risk, right? They harm humans in the home and animals in the home. So how do they appear on scene? They are overwhelmingly, statistically significantly more likely to be reported by police officers to appear calm, apologetic, and crying. So again, data suggests they're the highest risk, but this is their physical presentation, much more so than than looking at perpetrators who don't harm animals. And again, not to say we're not worried about them too. I'm just saying data seems to indicate that there's a much higher risk here when we have this pet abuse piece. And when you think about those things, kind of the natural human reaction is to kind of breathe a sigh of relief, to take a break. Here we have a perpetrator who's calm, they're apologizing, they're crying, they're really sorry, you know, maybe this was blown out of proportion or something like that. We don't know what's right below the surface though. And I think that's such an important thing to think about. The wrong word, the wrong thing. I mean, many of these perpetrators, just in general, but particularly when we add in this pet piece, are excellent mask wearers. They're very good at acting one way with the family in the home and turning that off. And in fact, many of them take pride in that, and this idea of being able to quote unquote fool those outside the home, and to try to discredit any claims that could be made by those in the home. We see them taking pride in that. So I think it's just an important thing to note that while the data indicates they present the highest risk, they are statistically significantly more likely to appear physically in a way that may cause you to kind of, again, question whether there really is that risk there. Two approaches or two things I'm going to share, and then I'm going to wrap up here pretty close to on time. And there are many of these out there. Just for sake of time, I'm just sharing one thing. I was particularly impressed by a program that I actually ended up co-presenting at a conference in San Diego a few years ago, with a program named Mi Escuelita, which is a school that's designed specifically for children who come from homes where partner violence has occurred. It's a preschool, and again, set up specifically for them as part of their admission criteria. Their whole staff is trained in trauma-informed care. They spend a great deal of time, seemingly an effort in addressing some of these emotional and mental things that we described. You know, I don't want to share all that information and then paint it as it's an impossible picture. Not at all the case. This school, with an independent study from the University of San Diego, found that children who went to their program actually performed as good or better than their peers in the public school system, going on beyond that. So again, it's this idea that I don't talk about brain changes and things like that to say there's no hope. I just know that it's important that we address it, understand it. And when we effectively address it and understand it, we can help these children kind of navigate some of those difficulties, and they can do quite well, obviously. Another obviously critical piece from everything I've talked about is sheltering pets with these families. They will not leave. We often push for families to get out, to escape an abusive home. They will not go if you can't protect their pet. I hear that over and over again. I'll leave in my car. I'll be homeless. I'll stay. They will not go if they have to leave that pet behind. And many of them who do go back to get that pet. They're just not comfortable with that. Here you see an agency, I think this one, yeah, Pennsylvania. The Eagle Scouts in the community actually donated their time and the materials to build this shelter, to allow this domestic violence shelter to have at least a place for some animals. And this was actually a partnership through, again, the program Red Rover, who I mentioned before. And you may look at that and think, well, it's just a few animals, but to those families that are able to bring that animal, that's a big deal. So again, trying to figure out ways to allow these families to heal together. These pets, they stand with these victims, they cry with these victims, they hurt with them, and they should be allowed to heal together too. As I said before, I speak often with passion for my own emotional harm and experiences, and I say without a doubt that dog you see there saved my life. This is pretty early on, and our bond was almost immediate, and it just continued to grow stronger. But I say that without hesitation, that the life-breathing energy that dog gave to me saved my life. I struggled for so long. People would ask me, what do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to be? Like I have absorbed this lie that my life was of no account. And I think many children do. I can see that picture and I know the harm and the hurt there, and what I was feeling. And many of these children in these environments take that on. They believe their life is of no account. They don't matter. There's no hope. There's no future. I believe that completely. Again, people ask, what do you want to do with when you grow up? I'd say it doesn't matter. I thought I could never be happy, that I could never have my own kids. How could I be a good dad if without a blueprint, right? How could I do those things? And that dog breathed such life into me, and he not only saved my life, but he gave it such hope. And that I would hear, again, he never said a word, but I would hear his voice as I got older. And this idea that I often believed that I couldn't be a good dad, I couldn't have these things, couldn't be further from the truth. As you see me holding my third child there, my daughter, who just means the world to me, as all my children and family does. But again, I share that to say, we think about pets, they're important for so many reasons. They are everything to many of these kids. And so I say it again, as I said before, I don't believe we can best protect any in these homes unless we're acknowledging and protecting all in these homes. It's rare that I ever give a study without at least 160 something sources. I think today it was around 220. So here's just a sample. I can send more of those if you have interest. I referenced a study that's available, should be available in the email after the presentation, where this is my most recent study, although I'm writing the follow-up now that should be out in a couple weeks, but Elsevier published my article on how COVID-19 is dramatically impacting everything we've talked about, right? It's further complicated everything. It essentially increased all of the risk factors while also reducing opportunity to detect. So I tried to come up with some ways and some ideas there of how we might kind of navigate some of that that you can find there. And then there's some of my contact information. Again, feel free to email me with any, I think I speak 17 times this month, and so I try my best to get back as quickly as I can. It does take me some time, but please, if you have questions, concerns, would like further information, I'm here to help, and I want to help in this fight the best I can, so please reach out and feel free to do so. So thank you for your time and attention, and then I think, Sandy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Andrew, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm sure that those who attended today learned a great deal about this issue, and hopefully a discussion or a call to action can result from what we learned. I know, as Andrew mentioned, that he and Prevent Child Abuse Indiana, we've been working together for a couple of years now, looking at that connection with pet abuse, domestic violence, and child abuse. We're taking a look at the data, such as Andrew shared. And, we're looking at some selected counties, and we hope we can use this data to take back to the communities to aid them in looking at some prevention measures. So again, I thank you. I hope you all will take care of yourselves after this. I know it wasn't easy, so please reach out for help or support if you need to. So I have a quick question, if you don't mind, Andrew.
Yes.
You talked a little bit about COVID, and I'm curious, since so many children and families are still, doing things virtually, learning virtually, or even having some mental health uh, support virtually. Is there something that teachers or family or counselors can kind of look for virtually in terms of, some signs or questions they can ask?
Great question, and one that, obviously as we've worked through these things, we've talked about as well. It's such difficult times that we find ourselves in. It's not, in my opinion, that we were necessarily winning the fight against family violence before all this. Doesn't mean we weren't doing good things, and there's not a lot of great people out there doing good work. It's just such an overwhelming issue. From what I've learned and from what I've heard, and thinking specifically from child abuse pediatricians, a few that I've communicated with that we're actually working on a paper about, they continue to find value in asking about pets. And I know sometimes it's difficult when you're in kind of a group setting. When you're in more of a group setting, obviously that, it may be more difficult to detect. But if you do have that one-on-one time with a student or a child where there is some sort of time where it's individualized, asking about pets actually can open up a lot of things. And I know that there are several child abuse pediatricians around the country that are exploring that and doing it more for a number of reasons. Just asking about a pet, again, if a child is in an abusive home or where abuse is occurring and that pet is their safe space, they're going to feel comfortable talking about that, and they're going to relax. It kind of opens the door there, and I hear that from child abuse pediatricians, this idea that talking about that animal makes the child feel more comfortable to talk to me and be truthful with me, because it brings them to a safe place emotionally where they know that. Unfortunately, then the flip side, right, if the pet is being abused in the home, that's usually something that kind of starts that conversation too. So I know I've talked about pets a lot today, but I really don't think it can be overstated how important they are. I think when we think about moving forward and advancing and looking at progressing, I think it's a critical component. And it's not new or novel. The idea of animal welfare and child welfare working together in the U.S. is not new. It's actually where we started. Child welfare actually sprang from animal welfare in the U.S. So it's not some sort of new idea. It's actually just a return to our roots. We've separated over the years, and there's so many reasons why it's important that we get back together to protect animals and especially and humans as well.
Sandy and Andrew, thank you so much for telling us about all these things. And now it's Wendy's turn. Wendy will be taking your questions from the question box. Wendy, take it over.
Our first question, Andrew, is there data from all over the state or just in the areas that you've discussed?
My understanding is we're the first to do this project anywhere in the country. I have other states reaching out with interest about doing it too. So we're looking for more communities to partner with. I think we've done about maybe 8 now, I think, that we've gotten, and but we're continuing the project and trying to expand across the entire state. So it's something that if in your community it's something you have interest with doing, that we would love to partner with you over. And like I said, I'm hearing from multiple states around the country who are interested in doing it as well. As far as I know, we're the first to look at it from this specific angle.
Okay, great, thank you. And could you talk a little bit more about examples of successful collaborations that you're aware of that have helped to improve outcomes or policy changes?
Right, and so I think that's key anytime we talk about any of these things. Thinking particularly of COVID-19 and how it's impacted everything, and again thinking about restricted access to many of these families that we were concerned about before, and then again we think about then losing our schools are our top reporter, and many other top reporters kind of lost access, even within the medical community, with a lot of families fearing the virus and being afraid to go in to seek medical care and things like that, kind of losing that opportunity. One of the unique things I thought that was pretty interesting was a law enforcement agency here in Indiana, and I've heard some in other states too, who did reach out to some of the individuals who are still, even when everything was locked down, they were still in the community, such as mail deliverers, trash collectors, repair workers, and just providing information and saying, hey, this is something that we're concerned that risk is higher now, and we have fewer opportunities to detect. I think a good idea is even making just a little card, a simple card that says, this is, just summarize, this is what we're worried about, and here's who you call if you see it. Many of these individuals likely already have families. They may have, they may see more than we even realize, or that other families realize. And they may already have families they're worried about. And so just reaching out to them and saying, hey, we need your help, we need your assistance. Animal control was also deemed essential. So they also were still responding to incidents, with neighbors even more likely to report. So again, I did hear of instances where that seemed to be helpful in terms of thinking about kind of outside the box and exploring relationships with community partners we should have been working with before. but absolutely now and moving forward, it makes sense. I mean, it's not like we have family violence figured out and it's going away. In my opinion, we need all the help we can get. It makes sense. Reach out to other community partners and agencies who you may not have considered before, who may be helpful. And many of them, in my experience, want to help. They just haven't been asked. And I called all 94 Indiana counties and animal welfare in all 94, and 92 were overwhelmingly wanted to be more involved in this child welfare piece. The other two, it was a little different, but I focused on the 92 that were very interested and said, we have never really been asked that or thought about it, but we want to help. We would love to help if we could. So.
Thank you. Another question around collaboration and partnering, and you've talked a little bit about partnering with the police. Anything else you want to say about that, or specifically with schools or universities?
I think I said 94. So 92 Indiana counties, I believe I'm correct. So 90 were positive out of 92. I want to make sure I got that right. But yeah, and again, working with law enforcement, schools, and communities is all critical. I also think the faith-based organization has huge opportunity there. It's sometimes, for whatever reason, and it's literally a 90-minute talk I give just on that piece. I think there's great opportunity there. I'm also exploring spatial mapping and looking where incidents occur in relation to churches. And many churches in urban areas can look out their front window and at least see 3 homes where domestic violence is currently occurring. So they are actually located specifically in areas that would be extremely helpful to engage, again, in an effective and a healthy and helpful way to help these families. But obviously providing law enforcement education is important and a passion of mine. I can think of many individuals as I've gone and spoken throughout the country that come forward after and say, I think one officer in particular in tears who said, for some reason, I had thought that children who couldn't speak were not being impacted. And again, it's not this, I hear that from other agencies too. I actually hear that quite a bit, and I don't know necessarily where that comes from. I know there's data and science looking at, when our earliest memories occur, and I think sometimes that gets leads to some misguided information about how children are impacted in these homes. But I remember that particular officer saying, I'd never heard anyone talk about it the way you just did. Trust me, I will never go into another home without looking at every child in that home, regardless of age, and taking notes. So you can never underestimate how much providing some of this education. We can't just assume people know these things, but in a way, and doing it in a way that they'll receive. We can't just say, we know everything, you have to hear this, but doing it in a way that obviously you're helping them to serve the families that they likely want to help anyway better. So.
Thank you very much. Speaking of education, what additional training for law enforcement do you think should be included around this topic?
The thing that speaks out the most to me, I think, again, is when we see the studies that talk about this, only 4% have visual injury. They're usually utilizing sometimes law enforcement data. And so I think that's something that has been kind of, again, we kind of, and not just because we underplay the emotional injury. I know it's harder to detect and harder to prove and things like that in the courtroom. But sometimes, and I think in my work with agencies around the country, there are many that still kind of adhere to this belief that we're looking for observable physical injury as an indicator that children have been harmed, or the idea that if the child didn't visually see the incident occur, that they weren't harmed. But again, if you think about what I shared with the timeline, just because they weren't physically harmed at the 10th incident, which on average is when you're reporting, doesn't mean they weren't harmed through the first 9, and it doesn't mean they won't be harmed on the 11th. So just because we don't have a child who's standing here with blood or bruises doesn't mean they're at great risk. And that's something that I've actually had a good response from when I talk about those types of things, and I think it's helpful for some of them to think through some of those things.
I think we covered that we don't have any specific Northwest Indiana data regarding these connections, but if there were stakeholders who were interested in moving that forward, what would the next steps be?
Just email me. Like I said, we're looking. This is I think it's exciting because it just provides a, again, it's not that we don't know that it's already there. It's just a different way to appreciate it. And again, most of these maps, it's not population density maps. It's literally an overlap of where things are occurring. We think of the field of family violence and how limited resources always are. And so when I look at these areas, it's not as targeting them for anything other than that they're in need of resources. And so if we have limited resources, we know that these specific spatial geographic areas probably have the greatest need. Great opportunity to reach out to churches in those areas, to other organizations in these areas, say, we're worried about this across our whole community, but we know specifically in these several blocks that this is a major issue. Would you be willing to take part in education, to learn more about these issues so that you might find ways that we could partner with you to kind of reach these families?
Thank you for that. We did get another question in.
Yeah.
How do you deal with resistance to the ideas that you're talking about or the programs that you're?
Well, it's common, and that's you know, anyone who works with anything in this field knows that anything you do, if it's different than what someone else is doing, you're going to meet resistance, and that occurs. I think I've learned to deal with it a little better, and that I try to, you know, I have my own opinions, I have my own experience, but one of the values in using some of this data and mapping is it's kind of hard to, I mean, ignore it. Or if I'm just presenting information that someone else has collected and here's how it looks and what it does, I kind of rely more on that. So while I don't want anyone ever to, you know, I try never to give up on anyone, and I try to find a way to find common ground and work through partnerships. At the end of the day, if there seems to be an obstacle that they're just not going to, you know, change, and they are in the path of what I'm needing to do, my goal then becomes, well, let's find a way to accurately and effectively show enough information that they're not going to really have any argument left. And that's kind of the way that I've learned to kind of handle that.
One final question. You've shared yourself how kind of emotionally taxing these presentations can be. And I imagine they can be for audience members as well who may have a history of abuse or trauma. Tell us a little bit about how you've been able to respond to that as you've been speaking throughout the country.
It's been, I mean, it's been a process, and I struggled with it at first. It was something I did not, it's not like I just figured it out one, you know, that it's been a process. And like I said, when we think about victimization, I understand the power in the word survivor, and I'm not taking anything from that. I just think when we talk about the emotional harm, it's more surviving than it is survivor, because it doesn't relent. And so you're constantly dealing with that. And so even if I wasn't speaking about these issues, I would be dealing with it to a certain extent. Speaking about it obviously always brings it back, and it brings it. But it's about having healthy boundaries. You know, for me, it's a little different because this is my job. And so when I'm working, I'm thinking about the things that cause me that harm. I always try to find separation. Physical activity has always helped me as being kind of a barrier. You know, I always tried to keep it separate from my family, and then I would leave and work and think about these things and then come back. And then unfortunately during the pandemic, you know, I'm here. I mean, there's nowhere to go. So you're working with your family. And so finding just barriers and kind of working to decompartmentalize some of those things, but then also acknowledging that it's okay to feel that way, because you have been through a lot and you've been through a trauma. And when possible, surrounding yourself, you know, with those who acknowledge and understand that as well, and can be there for you and be a source of help and comfort, as opposed to kind of pushing you in a different direction. And I've had to go both ways, and then I've worked hard to try to eliminate some of that negative energy from others who maybe didn't understand, and were pushing me in that way. So again, surrounding whenever possible yourself with those who can be supportive, or you know, through that makes a big difference too.
Andrew, we're receiving some comments about how much the presentation has meant to some of our attendees who have experienced similar issues growing up. So thank you for that as well.
Good. I'm sorry to hear that they've experienced that, but like I said, this is how I fight back. I want to help any way I can. So to those people in particular, if there's anything that I could do to provide more information, please reach out and I'll get it to you. So.
As of right now, we have made it through all of our questions. So I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Hug to help close our session.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sandy and Wendy, and of course, Andrew. Let me say we'd like to thank all of our funders, particularly Geminis Community Partners and the Service League of Northwest Indiana, and also our other community partners. So they will be in the credits, which will be rolling shortly. So thank you again, and thank you for all you do for Indiana's children and families. Have a good weekend.